Hello everyone and welcome to this new video. In this episode we are going to talk about color, pigments, and I'm going to share with you my ideal palettes, and also we are going to see some strategies that I use to create realistic colors. Alright, so I'm going to share with you my ideal palette. Of course, these pigments are those that I use the most and that I find to be the most useful and that I have really the best feeling with. A lot of time it's really about the feeling, how you feel when you use this pigment, because it's not just about the color, it's also about the handling properties, the drying time, the transparency, and all these things. Well, maybe those pigments will not be the one for you, but at least I'm going to try to explain why I love them so much. And then I'm going to show you my mixing strategies. And I chose these pigments because they are all around the color wheel. And this is a very important thing. By the way, if you want to download this picture, you can go to my website on the resources for artists page and you can download it for free. It's a simple PDF, you just have to click download and you can get the picture and you can simply use it to make your own palette choices. Alright, so like I said, if I want to mix a little bit of everything, I want to have all the potential on my palette. It's not going to be necessary every time, but I need to be capable of mixing a bright magenta or a very strong green or a very strong orange or whatever. So I need to have pigments that kind of circle around the entire color wheel. And I really want to have the widest spectrum covered. So I need a good red, I need a good yellow, I need a good green, I need a good cyan, I need a good blue and a good magenta. Alright, the white that I prefer is titanium white. This is the best white, hands down. I mean, you don't have a lot of whites. Zinc white is a little bit too weak for me and I don't really like using it. Titanium white is very chalky, very strong in terms of white. It's very opaque. It's very white and it's kind of it has a cool tendency to it. So it's more on the cool side. And a lot of people don't like titanium white that much, but I don't see how you can use something else. There is flake white or lead white, but well, where I live, it's completely impossible to find because of the regulations, because lead oxide is considered to be a toxic substance. So lead has been banned from most paints and you can't find it easily. So it's almost impossible to find. So I don't even try. Like, don't think that lead white is going to bring something like extremely beneficial. It's a good white. Don't get me wrong. It's a good white. It has good properties, especially the drying time and the consistency is great. It's very pleasant to paint with. Since it's not available in my country, I don't see why I should like buy it from abroad and have it shipped to me just because it's a white. I can paint perfectly well with anything, any white. Zinc white I don't use because I find it to be a little bit too weak and not white enough. So this is why I prefer to use titanium white. And by the way, most of the titanium whites that you can find are actually mixtures of titanium and zinc, so you get just the right consistency and usually they're very good and I like them, they're decent enough. Next you have yellow ochre, which is what I use the most. PY42, this is the synthetic yellow ochre, not the natural one. And if I need something a little bit more yellow, I'm going to use something like cadmium yellow. Now I know there's this big controversy about cadmiums. If you don't want to use cadmium, just use benzimida yellow, for example, which is often called permanent yellow or cadmium yellow substitute or cadmium yellow hue. And it's going to be just working exactly the same way. It's a little bit less opaque, less strong, but it's going to work perfectly fine. After that, a pigment that I use really a lot of the time is transparent red oxide. I really love this pigment. I find it to be one of the most useful ones for flesh tones. Sometimes you can see it under the name transparent burnt sienna. It's actually the same pigment, it's PR101, it's iron oxide. But this one, the fact that it's transparent, makes it very useful for skin tones. For the red, I use cadmium red. Again, if you don't want to use any cadmium, you can use pyrrole red, PR254, and it's going to work just as well. I think even like the cadmium it's going to be regulated very severely in the EU, for example, so it might be a good option to consider right now, because I think if you live in the EU, soon there's going to be some restrictions around the use of cadmiums. It's not like official yet, but I think that they are sort of investigating the thing. So it might be a good idea to start switching immediately to pyrrole red, because like in the future, who knows, it might be just like lead, it might be considered like too bad for painters. Again, paint safely. If you need to learn about oil painting safety, it's also on my resources for artists. I made a video about painting safely for artists. Just don't have food around, don't eat around your paint, don't use your fingers, don't put anything in your mouth, and you're gonna be fine with cadmium or anything. But if they want to put regulations and forbid us to use these things, we have alternatives, which is why the color wheel system is great, because you can have like various options for the same color. It's just like for the red, you have several options. You have multiple pigments at your disposal. You don't just need this very specific one. Whatever I use is just based on where it sits around the color wheel. But if I need to use something else, I'm going to use something else. I don't care. If they ban cadmium, I don't care. I just use something else and it's going to work just as well. As far as magenta goes, I use a quinacridone rose. You can also use quinacridone magenta, PV19. They work really well. You can substitute that for an alizarin crimson, for example. Like it's more of the traditional pigments, a little bit more on the dark side and a little bit more on the red side, but it's going to work just the same way. And as far as the blue goes, I use ultramarine blue. This baby, I would never trade it for anything in the world. It's the greatest color, I think, that I can find. It's so dark and intense and strong. It's brightly transparent, but it's dark at the same time. And I also love this baby. This is cobalt teal blue. If you know me, you know that I love this color. It's a little bit expensive, of course, but I use it very sparingly, just a touch of it from time to time. It's a very, very useful color because it's a cyan, and you need a cyan. If you don't have a cyan, there's an entire part of your color wheel that's completely missing, and you're missing an entire part of the color spectrum. So if you think that you can just use yellow and blue to mix everything in this part right here, in this entire part of the spectrum, you're gonna miss a lot of chromatic power, because this one is bright and it's strong in color, so it's going to allow you to create a lot of variety, especially in the greens, in the blue range. You can mix it with a lot of things and it's going to help you a lot. As far as green goes, I generally like to use what I consider to be the best example of like pure green, and not green mixed out of yellow and blue like many people think. I can do that. I often do that as well. If I need something dull, something like, you know, for vegetation, this green, I'm not going to use it necessarily to paint like foliage or trees and stuff, because it's too green. But it's what I consider the primary green, see? And this is a phthalo green yellow shade, PG36. It's a very good green. It's a very, very strong pigment. So I don't use it that much actually, like from time to time. It's good to have it around just in case. And of course, the pigments that I use the most, probably after white, is burnt umber. I really, really love this pigment. You have the real burnt umber, which dries very fast, which is something that I use a lot, especially in the earliest layers of the painting. So for example, I'll use a lot of burnt umber for the end of painting because I know that it's going to dry fast, and for the subsequent layers I'll use less and less if possible. If you don't want to use this fast drying action of the burnt umber, you can also use a substitute, which is a mix of black and iron oxide, which is this one. And it looks exactly the same, but it dries a lot slower, so it will maybe help you build those layers. Optional pigments that you can also use: ivory black, PBK9, of course, a great pigment. Slow drying can cause issues during the drying process, so most of the time I try to create my own black out of burnt umber and ultramarine blue, but it's also a good idea to have some ivory black around just in case. Another pigment that I often use is permanent alizarin crimson. The traditional alizarin crimson is not light fast, so I don't recommend that you use it, but you have some great modern substitutes for that. Another pigment that I can recommend, but it's more optional, is Venetian red, a super helpful and concentrated pigment that can bring a lot of variety in the orange, red, yellow range. Alright, so now let me explain a little bit about my color mixing strategy. Whenever I paint, I try to always prioritize values. So you'll see that my palette is organized so that I have several values. I usually try to have the highlights, which is the lightest color of them all. I also try to have some midtones and some shadows. So right here, for example, if I want to paint a white object, which is this white piece of fabric here, I'm going to try to have a mixture for the highlights, a mixture for the halftones, or the local color, depending, and a mixture for the shadows. And this is how I work. I always try to give the priority to the values, and this is the most important thing that you can do if you want to achieve realistic colors. Prioritize values. And speaking about giving the priority to values, the color wheel system that you can download from my website is also centered on value, because for each of the hues, it gives you a value scale that you can use directly. Now, of course, you're going to have to use some more chromatic mixtures. So here, for example, to mix this jar of powder, which contains phthalo green powder, I'm going to use some of my colors again, and see, this is the same strategy. I also try to have like various values. I adjust with blue, I adjust with phthalo green, I adjust with a touch of cobalt teal blue, cyan, until I have the right values. More importantly, what I try to do is have the right colors for the shadows, have the right color for the midtones, and have the right color for the highlights. You don't have to mix 3 tones like this all the time. You can mix more, you can mix less. What's important is that you always keep in mind that what matters for painting realistic objects is not necessarily the hue. What matters is not what pigments exactly you use, because you can reach the same type of appearance with a lot of different pigments. What matters most is how you match the values of your model with the values that you are capable of mixing on your palette. Now, for every single mixture, there is an order that I need to follow: hue, value, and chroma, in this order. If you keep this order, you'll see that it will simplify your color mixing approach. If you don't remember what chroma, value, and hue are, these are the fundamental dimensions of color, and I talk in great depth about those in my previous color mixing videos, so I encourage you to have a look. It's on YouTube. This order is really the main structure that I use for color mixing. Whenever I have a doubt, it's not something that I do mechanically, it's more something that's like, you know, somewhere in my head. I know that if I need to choose whenever I need to mix a single sample of color, I know that it should be hue first, and then value, and then adjust the chroma. When painting complex objects like this one, you can see that this palette, this go-to palette that I have, allows me to mix a little bit of everything. Really, I can mix most of the colors because I chose pigments that are ideally located all around the color wheel, and I'm not limiting myself to, I don't know, red, yellow, and blue, for example, which is missing a whole lot of areas around the wheel. So by keeping in mind that I need to use several pigments if I want to have the greatest diversity in terms of color and the greatest degree of variety and the greatest chromatic potential for all the colors that I mix. By keeping this in mind, I'm capable of mixing realistic colors from all over the spectrum, and I can really circle around the wheel. If I have a doubt, if I need another pigment, I can always refer to my color wheel again and find a new pigment that I can add to complement the others. All pigments have their limitations. It might be limitations in drying time. It might be that they are not colorful enough. It might be that they are not bright enough. It might be that they are too dark. So you have to really switch around, and you should never be afraid to have multiple pigments. Sometimes this or this pigment will work, and sometimes it will not work because, I don't know, maybe it's too transparent. Maybe it dries too slowly, or you know, for whatever reason, a pigment might not be the right one for a specific thing that you need to paint. So it's always a good idea to have multiple options at your disposal. And I really hope that this color wheel can help people decide and see what are the advantages of most of the most frequently used pigments. Alright, that's it. That's my go-to palette. Let me know what pigments you use most of the time in the comments below. I'm really curious about this. And remember that you can download the color wheel system if you want. It's on my website. It's free, so you can just get it and find the right pigments for you. And if you want to learn more, of course, you also have my oil painting course, The Art and Practice of Color. You'll find the links in the description below as well. Alright, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you for the next one. And until then, have fun painting. Bye.